Hello, and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 8th episode in our ongoing series. For our April 2023 podcast, Lance Strate and Thom Gencarelli interview Gary Gumpert, a senior scholar in the field of communication and the president of the Urban Communication Foundation. Their dialogue covers the entirety of Dr. Gumpert's life and times, from his childhood escaping from the Holocaust, to his early career in radio and television broadcasting, to his work as a communication scholar. Along the way, we find a consistent emphasis on the themes of community and connection. Let's listen in.
Well, welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Lance Strate. I'm here with Thom Gencarelli, and our special guest for this episode is Gary Gumpert, and special particularly for Thom and I because we're both former students of Gary. Dr. Gumpert is Emeritus Professor of Communication at Queens College of the City University of New York and President of the Urban Communication Foundation. His creative career as a TV director and academic career as a scholar spans over 60 years. He's a series editor of the Urban Communication series and has authored and edited a number of books, including Talking Tombstones and Other Tales of the Media Age, The Urban Communication Reader, Regulating Convergence, and Regulating Social Media. He was the recipient of the Media Ecology Association's Neil Postman Award for Career Achievement in Public Intellectual Activity, and his primary research and theory agenda focuses on the impact of communication technology upon social and urban space. Gary, welcome to our podcast. It's great to have you here. And we recently observed a special milestone in your life just a couple of months ago, your 90th birthday. That would mean that you were born at the start of 1933. If my math is correct.
It is correct.
And you were born in Germany?
Yes, I was born in Mülheim am Moor, but lived in Düsseldorf until 1938, and then escaped to Amsterdam, and then finally came to the United States in December of 1939.
And do you have memories of those times in Germany and Holland?
Very much so. I'm trying to write about those years right now, and it's a strange task. As Proust once wrote about the tasting of a Madeleine opening up a flood of memories, I'm trying to open up a flood of memories as well. What is real as a youngster, what I'm making up, but it's interesting to go back and look at what happened from what I know today. And during that time between, I would say 1937 and almost 1940, my family and I ran around Europe and probably visited 5, 6, 7 countries. Now I understand why, as we were trying to get a passport and to get a quota, fit into the quota system that allowed us to come to the United States.
Sorry, as you're writing memories down, are there like one or two that you'd like to share with us?
The one is most humorous, I think, is being quarantined on a boat in Marseille, France, probably in 1938. And so I would have been, 5 years old. And I was told that I had some sort of a disease and that I would not be able to go into France. What is much more likely now is that my father was searching for a way to get a passport. Well, it's interesting because I recently translated a letter from a doctor in France, in Marseille, written to whom it may concern, and gave a fictitious street where we lived on, or we thought we lived on, but identified us as legitimate human beings. But the reality was that we never lived in France at that time, and it was all subterfuge. The return to Amsterdam has always been interesting for me, because I realized I entered the house where I once lived. We were given a year to live in Holland before they would kick us out or send us back to Germany. They gave us the year 1938. So we escaped. My uncle died in Auschwitz. My grandfather and grandmother and uncle wound up in Shanghai, China. I recently visited that area in which they lived and found where their quarters were. So my uncle, part of that family, then went to China during the war and stayed there until 1949.
As a German Jew, do you have memories of the Nazis?
Not personally, only in terms of what I've been able to reconstruct.
Mm-hmm.
So that I was able to reconstruct the night in 1938 in which the pogrom occurred, and my grandfather, living in a village in France, wound up being thrown down the steps by German thugs, and he recovered from that. I also recall being in a car with my parents, and in the middle of the night, we came upon an accident, and it turned to be a German military cyclist who had crashed and had gotten killed on the highway, and my parents tried to help. But I personally found myself very safe, except perhaps the nightmares that followed. And one of the things that I don't know whether I've written about it or not, but in the memoirs that I'm working on now, it came from the trip to the United States on a Dutch boat called the Zaandam. In the middle of the night, we were called up and told to put on life preservers. My sister was 3 months old and was in a particular kind of waterproof carriage that if we were sunk by a U-boat or hit a mine, that she might survive, at least for a little while. So it was simply a drill. But the nightmare that persisted, and I still think of it, is that I fell off the boat in the middle of the night, and no one cared. And I kept yelling and screaming as the boat receded into the distance. And I don't know what happened to me, but that's a remnant of that I was involved with. So a lot of the stuff that I'm working on now is an attempt to reconstruct what happened then and who I was and how it affects me today.
And you arrived here in the States when?
December 19th, 1939. Moved to New York for about a half a year, and then to Philadelphia, where we lived until, I guess, in the 1950s.
And what was it like growing up in Philly then?
I loved it. It was a marvelous, marvelous place to grow up. And would later influence my career. Playing in the streets. I was a street kid. I grew up in the streets of West Philly, and we played all the games. I think I've written about it somewhere. touch football, basketball, stoop ball, play flipped cards, cops and robbers, and I'm still in love with the street, and saddened by the fact that that kind of street life is no longer possible. That we are afraid to be outside.
So you wound up going to Temple University?
Yes, I mean, the Temple story, in retrospect, is kind of interesting, because I think as I was going through elementary and then junior high school and so on, I had to learn to speak English. So that was a screwed up part of my life. Part of my life, I was skipped to finally get into the grade that I belonged in. But I lost out in terms of mathematics. I lost out in terms of the sciences. And I wanted desperately to go to a place called Central High School in Philadelphia. One of two schools which still gives a baccalaureate degree in the United States. But I was not a very good student. And I finally got to that school, and it took me an hour by subway every day, one way, through the Philadelphia subway systems to get to the school. And I was honored to be there and privileged to get out by, I don't know how the hell I got out, but I wanted to go to college at that point. And we had no money. But my father had, I don't know how he did it, some political pull, which allowed me then to get to Temple University. I did not deserve it, but I got a full scholarship. And I was not a very good student. The first semester I was there, I had 4 C's and 2 D's. And I did not become a good student until my junior year. And then something clicked in that brain of mine. And I don't think from that point on I ever received anything less than an A throughout my entire academic career. I often wondered what happened, but it may be because I discovered radio.
Well, I think it's, a myth that academics are all were started out as A students and honor roll and all of that. That's often not the case. What was your major?
At that time, there was no Department of Communication. And so I had to address 3 passions that I very quickly developed. One was the theater. So part of my major was in theater. The other was in radio. I began my broadcasting career as a disc jockey and then later as production director for WKAR, I think. I'm not sure of that. No, I'm sorry, WRTI in Philadelphia, at Temple University, which at that time was a wired station. And then eventually became broadcast, got a regular license. And then I also worked with WFIL in Philadelphia. The other area was speech. Those 3 different avenues were important as they intersected. And in terms of general semantics, as I say, I was not a very good student in those early days, but the names that came up were people who were general semanticists. Weinberg, Hayakawa, Wendell Johnson. Wendell Johnson did not teach there, but Weinberg did. Park Burgess, who I later hired at Queens College. But it is this strange melange of courses that come together, and I think helped me as finding myself and what I wanted to do. Although I'm still searching, but they were three distinct and separated strands. And what made me, I think, eventually that came together is that the strands came together in a unique way. It allowed me, as a director, eventually a director, television director. One of the interesting stories that I like to tell about Temple and WRTI. There was a man by the name of John Roberts who was the chairman of that department, and they were doing a show called The Miracle of America, which was being broadcast by WFIL in Philadelphia. And I then began as a sound engineer. That was my first job working with him for this program. And I became a sound engineer because I had grown up being passionately involved with classical music. And so when we got to a part in this 15-minute weekly broadcast in which we needed some musical note, or we used to call them a stinger. I would look at the script, and because I knew music, I was sent to go through the collection of 78 RPM classical recordings and find something that was appropriate. And we then developed a very an extraordinary system of coming in with a pile of records. And I would take a piece of chalk and mark on that record where the stinger would be. And then I had a pile of these records, and as we moved along in the show, I would have my hand on the record. The turntable was moving. I would backtrack at a half a turntable, and when the time came, I would let it go, open up the pot, and then ta-da! And there would be the stinger. But it was my relationship to music at that point, which I probably inherited from my parents, that allowed me then to begin there as a sound engineer, and then later as production head of then later directed those shows. And I still have the scripts today.
So tell us a little bit about the transition then to television.
Well, television is connected to my passion with radio, which is my first passion, of crawling into bed and under the covers and trying to get a distant radio station, which would be very interesting later as I tried to connect nations together technologically. Television had begun, but upon graduating from Temple University, I got a graduate assistantship to Michigan State University. And there my job was to produce a radio drama, a half-hour radio drama every week. Then taking some silly television courses at that time, which were not very good. There was a band leader by the name of Paul Whiteman, who was very much connected with the works of George Gershwin. So it has to be about 1953, maybe 54, when Paul Whiteman got involved in something in Philadelphia called the TV Teen Club. And that was the first television show I'd ever attended. And every Saturday I went to watch Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman was directly connected with Rhapsody in Blue. He may or may not have been the original conductor for for when it was broadcast. But I remember going to the Armory on Broad Street in Philadelphia and falling in love with this magical medium. And it was magical. Although the courses at Michigan State were not very good, but it gave me an opportunity, though. Michigan State was very important to me because I was fairly bored by the television courses, in love with the medium. And they were on a tri-semester system. It allowed then for the pain not to last as long as a semester. But I met a professor there by the name of Adrian Jaffe, who became my mentor. And I took classical literature with him. I took a course in French literature, a course in Latin literature. It was a marvelous, marvelous experience of dealing with a great scholar and who dealt with me with an honesty that I hope that I practiced as I became later a professor. And I remember at that time, I wrote a master's thesis based on an American Southern writer by the name of Catherine Ann Porter. She's not very popular these days, but A Ship of Fools was one of her creations, which later became a very bad film. And so the literature courses that I was taking, I then connected to television and wrote this television play. So that part of my education was extremely important. It gave me some freedom. It was French, Latin, and mostly important, Greek literature, which would later all serve as a major influence on my life.
And so you completed your master's there, and did you go directly from there to a PhD, or were you spending time working in between?
This was the time of the Korean War.
Ah, yeah.
And I made the decision that rather than being drafted, that I would volunteer for the draft and get it over with. Was then sent to South Carolina, Fort Jackson. And through a series of circumstances, I took care of a service club in terms of purchasing records. And I learned again more about music, particularly popular music, which I was fairly ignorant about. Again, because of a series of circumstances which are rather convoluted, I wound up at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, in the Signal Corps, and learned about motion pictures. And the man that taught me was Frank Capra Jr., the son of the great Frank Capra. And Frank Capra Jr. would then become my best man. And then I learned about motion pictures and was sent up. One of my assignments was to get up in an LC-19, given an assignment to photograph a particular area. And one of the areas that I remember photographing was the Monmouth racetrack, and the process of then opening up a window with the camera. You had a parachute on, but you had to loosen it. Your assignment was to photograph that racetrack and to change film magazines. It was a frightening experience, not because I was afraid of flying, but I was afraid of dropping the camera, which would result in an immediate court-martial. So that was a great experience. And then where did I go after that? I got married to Esther, who I met when I went to a canteen, a USO canteen in New York, wearing my uniform, and met this lady who was checking coats, but she had a book of poetry sitting next to her or on the desk, and we started talking about poetry. We got married a couple of years later, and she was my companion for 50, 60 years.
So do you remember when you decided to go on for your doctorate?
Yeah, but there was no doubt that there was a doubt. I wanted to become brilliant and famous, but I'm not sure whether I had the talent, frankly, as a television director. I loved the medium and got another assistantship at the University of Iowa, where I became their lighting director. And again, marvelous opportunity to have some great mentors. Two in particular. Donald Bryan, I think, was one of the worst teachers I've ever met, but brilliant. And I took my first course in rhetoric, and there I learned to read Aristotle and Plato. I took 2 semesters with him. And I don't know how I tolerated him or how he tolerated me. But it was a wonderful experience in retrospect to learn about the classics and to try to understand them. And one of my assignments was to search for a Jewish rhetorician, because in the second semester, I was reading nothing but religious rhetoric, St. Augustine and so on. And I wrote this terrible paper on the search for the Jewish rhetorician. So Donald Bryan, in retrospect, was a very important figure. The other great professor was O.G. Brockett, who I took courses in. It was a course in theater, and it required my writing a paper every week. It was a huge graduate class. And we wrote a 3-page paper every bloody week. And it came back the next week with 2 grades on it, one for the content and one for the ability to write something coherent without mistakes. A great teacher who later went to Indiana. And actually the third, which put me on the stage, was a famous director at that time by the name of James Clancy. So I had that ability, that chance to put ideas together that were disconnected for the average student. It was my job to connect them.
But you said this was at Iowa?
This was the University of Iowa. I spent 1 year there because, again, the passion of wanting to direct drove me then to a meeting by the name of a meeting with a man named Lee Dreyfus, who was at that point not the head of the program, but reported to a man named Paul Ricard at Wayne State University. Lee Dreyfus was one of the great influences in my life. He was not brilliant, but he was a Republican. I later found out, one of the few Republicans I ever enjoyed. But he was a brilliant administrator of human beings. He was able to manipulate them and teach them with a level of honesty that I'd never encountered before. Amazing. And I got this fellowship there. And again, for WKAR television, I was one of the directors.
This is at Wayne State?
This was at Wayne State. Yeah. It was a marvelous experience of having to do many kinds of television shows. Lee asked me then to attend a lecture at the Merle Palmer School in Detroit on Woodward Avenue. He said, "There's a man speaking there, and I'd like you to attend and find out what he's about." And it turned out to be Marshall McLuhan. And so that would be what year? I think 1959. And subsequently, Lee then asked me to produce a program with Marshall McLuhan. It was a difficult experience, and yet an enjoyable one. I think in retrospect, the television show is one of the worst things I've ever done. But working with McLuhan and learning about him and becoming his friend at that point was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And we lived on campus, and we had our first child, and Marshall would come over and bring a bottle of whiskey and smoked a cigar. And I tried to find out who the hell this man was. The television show is one of the worst things I've ever done, as I said. But learning about McLuhan and the way he thought would again be a major influence for me. I do not consider myself an expert on McLuhan. I probably know more than other people, but we did this show in the studio, and here's again a piece of historical. Now, the videotape had not yet been developed, and so what had to be done is that we send that signal to another station, and then that other station preserved the show on a kinescope via what is called a kinescope. A kinescope was essentially a film made off of the television screen. I still have a copy of it, and it haunts me. But I learned a little bit about McLuhan, and I think he became a friend, and he would later come to Queens College several times at my request. And he was a good colleague.
Want to talk about your dissertation, your doctorate?
I wrote a dissertation called Television Theater as an Art Form. couldn't get away from the classics, and essentially wrote about the development of theater as in terms of being a serious medium on television. Television in those days was a different medium from what we have today. It was strangely also a place where classical performances could be found. So I'm trying to think of the people I saw besides obviously Leonard Bernstein doing the young people's concerts, Salvador Dali being on the Ed Sullivan Show.
I'm just wondering, trying to line it up with, the golden age of television, that you finished your doctorate in what year?
If you're interested, and I'm not boring you too much, I had gotten married, and we left Iowa to go to Wayne State. We were there a few years. I had not finished the doctorate, and I got a job at Queens College, and I had not finished the doctorate yet, and was assigned to teach these terrible public speaking courses, which I hated doing because I'd left my medium. But I must tell you that I later found out that one of the students was Andrew Goodman in my speech class. And Andrew Goodman was one of the 3 freedom fighters who were killed in the South later on. I don't remember him very well, but I certainly realized that after when he was killed, and I looked through my grade book and I learned about him. I don't remember the grade I gave him, and I wouldn't disclose that anyhow. But then I got an invitation from Lee Dreyfus again. He says, look, come to Wisconsin as my senior producer at the television station at the University of Wisconsin. And I decided to do that. Would give me a chance to finish writing my dissertation and the opportunity to produce television shows. It was also significant that one of the problems of being a scholar in those days, and I was beginning to emerge as a scholar, was that in one area we had the speech department. Across the way, there was the journalism department. And here I was in the middle working for a division of broadcasters. And none of them talked to each other. And this was apparent stupidity, academic stupidity, which we would find over and over again. But I had this wonderful opportunity to do television shows, mainly because Lee Dreyfus gave me the liberty to do whatever I wanted to do. Part of it was successful. Some of it was not. My days would be numbered, and I would eventually return to Queens College. But in the process of that, we did one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my whole life. And that was to produce the first intercontinental classroom. It was Memorial Day it was under the realm of President Johnson at that point, and where we connected a classroom in Paris with a classroom in West Bend, Wisconsin. It's something that I will cherish for the rest of my life. Of magically doing what Edward R. Murrow, who was one of my heroes, had done with television earlier, where he had connected the West Coast of the United States with the East Coast. It was the first time that we saw on a split screen both the West Coast and East Coast together. In this case, what I was able to do was to produce with using a mobile unit, this classroom of silly American students dealing with sophisticated French students. And it was a disastrous first 15 minutes until one of the French sophisticated students and articulate in English said, why do you scream so when you hear the Beatles? And the young lady said, when a girl screams, she screamed. And then the magic of the program continued, where they talked to each other, human beings across, 3,000 miles. We'll always remember it. But my opportunity at Wisconsin is extremely important, because later on I left broadcasting and became a kind of a course doctor, going from department to department, producing instructional materials.
This was at Wisconsin or at
Wisconsin, yeah. So it was a chance to learn. I did a whole series of programs for the psychology department. Again, they were disastrous. I think they were not very successful. But I got an understanding of dealing with these scholars all around the university. It was a great university. It is a great university. And it taught me a lot, and I've always been grateful. And then during that time, I also finished my dissertation.
So why did you return to Queens then?
I think my days were numbered. The magic began to disappear a little bit in terms of doing television every day. And I got this invitation to come back to New York. And obviously my wife, Esther, thought this was wonderful. I already had my first child. And we returned then to New York and had a fabulous time at Queens College. I don't want to make this an ego trip, but what happened to Queens was unique, because when I got there, we still had a speech department. It was speech with radio and having some radio and television courses, oral interp, rhetoric. These were the mainstays of a department at that point. What I managed to do, I can't say, it's too egocentric to say I managed to do. Obviously, there were other people who played a role, is to morph into something new, to essentially say, look, these are just not radio and television courses. We're dealing with a hybrid, something coming together. I had an enormous respect for rhetoric. I had an enormous respect for all my colleagues. And we began to morph into something new. And then again, all of this is by accident. Initially, I had two jobs at Queens College. One was to be in charge of the television studio. It was a step down in terms of what I'd been used to. But that was my job, to teach courses and to run the television studio. But there was warfare going on between various factions in the department. And one man who had hired me by the name of Russell Wines, he left, and they brought in a man by the name of Robert Cathcart. Queens was a special place then, as some of you know. A place where we ran up and down the halls and talked to each other and screamed at each other and learned to love each other. It was an amazing place. But I mentioned Bob Cathcart because the two of us became friends. Bob Cathcart, in his 6'3" height, and me at that time I was still tall, 5'7", became collaborators. They brought him in, and we worked together. And I think came out with a fundamentally important book, which was called Intermedia, which was based on both of our notions that we need to come together, and that brought that radio and television and media were not separate entities, but were intertwined in the concept of communication. So communication became the foreground, not speech. And those were three very important volumes that we did that I think would change the field. It was just sheer luck.
And it was also about connecting to interpersonal communication, which was largely, almost entirely about face-to-face communication back then.
Exactly.
So you were challenging the dominant paradigm, both of mass communication and interpersonal communication, which existed as two separate silos.
And it all came together, and it was very, very exciting. The other thing that was exciting for me, at the University of Wisconsin, there was a course, I'm trying to remember who the first person was, a man in history, who then later worked with a man named Richard Byrne, who was a brilliant professor of film. They developed a concept of multimedia teaching. And I was very impressed with this. Again, part of it was my infatuation with the visual arts. When I got to Queens College, there were two rooms that had been set up in their main building with rear screen projection built in. And I indicated I would like to start a multimedia lab there and start teaching courses that way. And at that point, there was still money around. Indeed, I designed a place, a podium. I needed a podium to work from. And I didn't realize that I had chosen the thing that the President of the United States was also using, something that would go up and down and had all the gadgets in it and so on. And they said, do you really need this? And I said, yeah, I need it. And we began to teach. I began to teach a course, very, very fundamental. The technology was, what is it called?
The multi-image, you mean?
No. It was a question of computers were in their infancy to some extent at that point, and that we would punch holes in a series of pieces of paper, rolls of paper, and that wherever we punched the hole, that would trigger then a normal projector. And so you had multiple screens going on. It turned out to be just wonderful. And I enjoyed teaching that later to 200, 300 students, and also had some miserable creatures who worked with me. One of them, which was were the two of you.
That was a great education, learning about that. That's also a kind of a medium of technology that's largely been forgotten. I was just telling my students about it the other day, and about, like they don't realize that PowerPoint is based on actual slideshows, and how that medium worked, and how multi-image slideshows had been developed using an earlier form of computer technology before it was all digitized.
It was very, very exciting. And I later then taught, I think it was a summer session, just a course in how do you create images this way and morph them into effective teaching. Some great thoughts up. We had some good students. There were 200-300 students in there. And they were wonderful.
And by the way, since we're up to, that time around when Lance and I were students, and going back to what you were saying about intermedia and how it came about, I remember being invited to be the graduate student rep, going to faculty meetings, and it was a Department of Communication Arts and Sciences. So we were with the communication disorders people and the speech pathologists and also the film studies people. And, to have that group of disparate peoples all together and working together and sharing together, that, it was fantastic. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it truly was, and we've never been able to capture it. I've not been able to capture it again. There's something about it where the faculty was forced to talk to each other, which is interesting, because faculty today are disunited, I think. And at that point, I later became chair of that department for two. I can think of no other person less likely to be a chair than me.
Yeah.
I'm not an administrator, but I did a good job for 7 years, I think.
Wow.
Before I went on sabbatical.
It was also in this period that you published Talking Tombstones.
Yes. It's a book I love. It's a fun book. And again, that was the result of living in a different world. The editor Oxford University published the 3 volumes of Intermedia. And my editor at that point was a man by the name of John Wright. And John was a brilliant editor, encouraged me to do further writing. I went on sabbatical and wound up in a French village somewhere near the Pyrenees, but the village was called Les Tours. Tiny, tiny place with a bakery and a bar. And that was it.
What more do you need?
Not much. A place for social interaction, which would later become a major theme in my career, to look at the nature of social interaction in villages. But I walked into the cemetery up on the hill, and I still remember it. And as I approached it, I found 2 tombstones there. One was a young girl, and they had embedded or embossed a photograph of her in a party dress. And that was placed on the tombstone. And the other one, I think it's in the book, is of a soldier whose image was also embossed on a headstone. And somehow, though, I never escaped from those 2 images, and developed that into an essay. Or I think the first essay in the book on talking tombstones, which then represents the merging of technology into social interaction. And that's become a theme for me over the years. I've never run away from it. And there's a series of other essays there, but essentially morphing human social interaction with technology. And it's a lovely book.
But two of the chapters were kind of expanded from a piece you published in Etc. called The Ambiguity of Perception, which was published back when Neil Postman was editor of Etc. And your students, Ed Wachtel and Joshua Meyerowitz, were working on the journal as well as completing their doctorates with Postman.
Yeah, those were terribly exciting days. We were doing things that were new and that we were passionate about, and it gave me the opportunity to develop a voice outside of the narrow constructs of what later became academic publishing.
If I can interrupt for a second, it's become a running theme to talk about these, exciting and terrific times as you look back. But it seems to me that that's the story of your career, because it's continued, right? That, you're always in the midst of trying to do exciting and timely work and to remain vital and find new pathways. I mean, that's the theme of your academic life and career.
Well, I was always afraid of boring myself. I felt that teaching had to be a thing of passion. And I was very lucky, very, very lucky, because I had these wonderful collaborators that I developed. I mentioned Lee Dreyfus, and I had these great mentors, and then Bob Cathcart. And then this strange woman enters my life by the name of Susan Drucker. And she's had a major, major influence on my life. I learned, she was my student. I gave her the lowest grade she ever received as a graduate student. I think it was a B+. She said, well, you're gonna have to work with me the rest of my life until you change the grade. And luckily I haven't changed the grade because she's brilliant. And it was at that point, was a student and finished her law degree and then became part of the department. It was, again, this extraordinary, magical department. I've worked with Susan for the last 35 years. Let me just dwell on Sue for a moment, because it's extremely important, because she's so bloody brilliant. And we're able to put together our passions. It's the passion of the law, and what I would then call my passion, the passion of social interaction. Those came together. I'm still confused. I'm not sure what the first article is that we wrote, but the one that I love more than any. Sometimes I love some of the work I've done, but we did a paper looking at zoning in New York City. Now, who would want to write about an article about zoning? But I had already fallen in love. I fall in love very easily, but I had already fallen in love with, after spending a great deal of time in Europe. That's a whole other world of mine. But being in a French cafe or in a Viennese cafe was very important to me. The ability to watch people interact with each other. And I wanted to link that both with that process and the development of media at the same time. I came back at some point to the United States after a sabbatical, trying to figure out, why can't we have cafes in New York City? And with the help of Sue, what we found is that there were certain the process of zoning said there's certain places you can't have cafes. You can't have a cafe on 57th Street, which is a broad street, because it was restricted. So there's this whole process of that we looked into, and it was a fun article to do and to research. That was the first of maybe 200 articles or books or whatever we've done. I'm not very good at keeping track of what I've done. Sue does that and continues to this day to work with me, and I'm very proud of her. She's taught me a lot.
Well, I was asking why you left Queens College and teaching in academia, why you retired, I should say.
We got to the point where students began to change, and I began to tire. And I felt I wasn't as effective as I should be, and that the academic world was becoming a more restrictive one. And so I had this wonderful opportunity at age 57 or 58 to retire. Now, there are two ways of retiring. One is my friend Bob Cathcart retired, and the academic world never heard of him again. I went a different route, that this was an opportunity to restore a passion to my work and to continue writing and exploring the world and to connect that in terms of publications. And so from age 57 to age 90, I've continued to that process of exploration and trying to write. How much of that is good is questionable. I'm still working on signing a new contract for another book now with Susan. And the next step in the development of Gigi was to look at what was happening to our cities in terms of communication. And we would attend certain meetings, NCA, National Communication Association. And at that time, we had opportunities to develop pre-conference meetings that would last the entire day. And there were wonderful, wonderful experiences of sitting around a table, and students and graduate students and faculty would present their ideas. And we never let anyone finish because we started ripping the stuff apart. It was absolutely a great deal of fun. Early on, then, we had the strange, irascible man from the University of Texas as one of the participants. This was open, by the way. At least, I don't know how many of them we had, maybe 5 or 6. The man said, "I love your work. I'd like to help you out." So we got back to New York from wherever we were, and I called this man, Greenberg, at the University of Texas. And we talked for a while, and then he gave me $1 million. And we created, it wasn't me, we created a concept called the Urban Communication Foundation. And so I've spent a great deal of my last 30 years, I guess, developing a concept, trying to bring together academic research and its connection to urban development. We wanted to go beyond Jane Jacobs, who had written about the impact of Robert Moses on the city of New York, and who was one of those voices from the streets who said we have to protect who we are in terms of the city. And so we've been writing and continue to write about what is happening to social interaction in cities, and how is that connected to the technology that begins to impact on us and changes us. So I can give you hundreds of examples of that, but it's become a major theme in my life, and I continue. Susan and I continue to work on it, and we're now starting to work on a textbook because we want to go beyond the stodginess of academic writing and have an impact outside of it.
I was going to say, I mean, hasn't the Urban Communication Foundation in effect served that you guys, are not just doing the writing work, but you're consultants and you've been called on, traveled around the world, to bringing it outside of the world of academia.
Yeah, it's also given us an opportunity to fall in love with other scholars. And they're really some amazing people. I fall in love very easily with scholarship. It starts maybe with Hayakawa, who was a very readable. I think it is interesting. Was Hayakawa, you think Hayakawa was writing just for the academic world? I don't think he was.
Oh, no,
I think
not at all.
And I don't want to lose that. I think those connections are very important for Susan and myself. I mean, a specific scholarship we can talk about, but it remains for me very, very exciting.
Seems to me that one of the connecting threads throughout your career could be understood in the general semantics dichotomy of the map and the territory and how they relate to one another, whether it's how media map out what's going on in the real world or the territory of cities and communities and social interaction.
I think that's true. The current scholar that I've fallen in love with is a man by the name of Johannes Pallasmaa, who we later had an opportunity to meet and took a class with him. He's an architect. Susan and I had met with Jan Gehl in Copenhagen, who is an astounding designer of urban space, and had gotten a chance to know Jan Gehl a little bit. And here we had, I came across, we had done some work with the Environmental Design Research Association in the United States, and then later with IAPS, which is a comparable group located in Europe. And they have taught us a great deal. It gave us a great opportunity to learn from architects and designers. And we saw an immediate link between communication and the design of structures and the design and urban planning. It gave us a great opportunity to look at it historically, to look at how was Paris created by Napoleon III when he redid Paris. So there's a relationship between Napoleon III and Haussmann and Jane Jacobs, and there's a whole exciting world that we've discovered. And Johannes Pallasmaa, I don't know how we got in touch with him. I think he was maybe mentioned by someone, I forget who it was, but he was a scholar. He's written a short book, and I'm not sure whether I wrote it down here. I've taken some notes. It'll come to me. But he was talking about the senses and what was happening in architecture and his dissatisfaction of what was happening with architecture, that it was too eye-oriented, and that it wasn't dealing with smells. It wasn't dealing with all of the senses coming together. And this is what has, I find very important and very exciting. I think it's called the eye of the skin. Part of growing up as a scholar is luck. We have become infatuated with architecture and the design of our cities. And obviously, how did technology alter our cities? In outside of this room where I'm now, I have my Olivetti typewriter. And I had a visitor the other day, a young professor, who saw that and he said, "How does the typewriter work?" That technology has changed. We don't know. Some of us have never worked on a typewriter before. And Johannes Polysma was unhappy with how structures were created. And he felt that the senses needed to be addressed. For me, I can smell Paris. One side of the hotel where I stay in Paris, I can smell the bakery. And when the wind goes another direction, I can smell the fromagerie and the marvelous cheeses. And you walk into Notre Dame before it was destroyed by fire and hopefully comes in, and you smell the church. You feel the temperature of the church. And so Susan and I wound up in Venice to attend the Biennale, because one of my colleagues who was administrating the foundation, Peter Haratonic, gave us a chance, who was also a Queens College student. And I didn't realize until later, took my television directing course. But he got us into the Biennale, which was an amazing thing of displays of different, sponsored by different countries. It was toward the end of the day. We heard some music, and I forced Sue to go up the steps to find out where's this music coming from. And we saw a banner sponsoring some sort of event by a Turkish group. And at that time, one of my sons was living in Turkey as a professor and had married a Turkish woman. And I started talking to the guy who was running this. And he says, Johannes Polysma will be giving a lecture here shortly. And then soon I then wound up as taking a master class with Johannes Polysma. Just sheer luck. And I've become very fond of that approach of looking at cities as in a humanistic way. They're not just stones, and they're places for human interaction. I could go on and on about this.
Yes, and we're well aware that you have only a limited time to give us, so we won't force you to do that, but perhaps we can continue this conversation at a later point. Is there any last words that you would like to leave us with before we conclude this episode?
Well, I don't like the way you put that.
Sorry about that.
What would you like him to say?
No, I don't know why. As he said that, I think of Richard Strauss's The Last Four Songs, which are these extraordinary orchestrated lieder that Strauss writes at the end of his life. And I'm not yet ready to recognize that I'm nearing the end of my life. I just have too much damn work.
Just for the end of the episode.
That's why we just invited you back. So,
well, there's a whole other area which I'd like to return to at some point that Susan and I have gotten involved, and that's the Holocaust. We've been doing an extensive amount of writing about this area, and plus it brings together my passion to find out who the hell I am in terms of growing up, but it also deals with how the world has reacted to the Holocaust and how it links to technology and media, whether it's from the concept of propaganda to the commemoration of what happened using other media, like we've been writing about something called Stolpersteiner.
Published in etc.
Yes, it is. But which are these metallic small pieces of commemoration that are placed in the pavements in front of a house that was once owned by Jews. So we're continuing to deal with the concept of the city as it speaks to us. And there are many ways, and I would love to come back and talk more about how the city speaks to us.
Well, that really brings us full circle back to the beginning of the episode. So I think that was a perfect way to close things off. We want to thank you very much, Gary, for spending time with us. Thom.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
And we look forward to further conversations and to seeing you in person before too long.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
You've been listening to our April 2023 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring an interview with Gary Gumpert. If you like what you've heard, and even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education in a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 8th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. But until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.